The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had stood for 11,000 years, 11,000 years. Of wars ended, treaties signed, civilizations managed, and species controlled. Its walls were carved from asteroid iron older than human memory. Its floors polished by the footsteps of ambassadors from 47 worlds. The air inside smelled of something ancient. Incense maybe, or the slow exhale of a power that had never once been challenged. It had never needed to be beautiful, it only needed to be permanent. Delegate Mara Akuno walked through its doors alone. She was 53 years old. Her hair was cut close to her scalp, salted gray at the temples. She had the kind of posture that came not from pride but from discipline, from years of carrying weight and deciding not to let it show. Before she was a diplomat, she had been a soldier. Before she was a soldier, she had been a girl. From Logos, who watched the first alien contact broadcast on a cracked screen in a school that couldn't afford textbooks, that girl had never imagined she would one day walk into the most powerful room in the galaxy. She walked in like she owned it. High Chancellor Veskara was already waiting. The VTH Kai were tall, nearly 3 m, with elongated skulls and skin the color of deep bruising. They moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a species that had never needed to hurry. The galaxy arranged itself around them. They did not arrange themselves around anything. Veskara didn't rise. When Mara entered, that itself was a message. Delegate Ayanquo, the translation unit, rendered the voice smooth and genderless. We appreciate your punctuality, Chancellor. Mara took her seat across the obsidian table. She did not look at the 47 holographic representatives floating around the room's edges. She kept her eyes on Veskara. I understand. There's something you want to say to Earth. There is. Veskara pressed long fingers together. The Council has reviewed humanity's accelerating militarization over the past 3 decades. You're faster than light developments, your expansion into contested space, your refusal to submit biological census data under the Galactic Accord. A pause, long and deliberate. The Council has concluded that humanity represents an emerging threat class civilization. The words landed like stones in still water. Mara said nothing. The terms of compliance are as follows. Veskara continued, and a holographic document materialized above the table. Humanity will surrender operational command of all military assets to Council oversight. Population growth beyond current figures will require Council approval. All faster than light research will be transferred to Council archives, and further development will be suspended indefinitely. The document rotated slowly. Clean, formatted bureaucratic violence dressed in formal language. Non-compliance, Veskara said, will result in a full sanctions package, including resource blockade and, if necessary, a corrective fleet engagement. The Chancellor tilted that enormous skull slightly. You have 48 hours to relay these terms to your government and return with confirmation of compliance. The hall was absolutely silent. 47 species watched on their holographic feeds. Some leaned forward, some exchanged glances. A few, the ones who had been managed and diminished by the Council for generations, watched the human woman with something close to pity. Mara sat with the terms for exactly 10 seconds. Then she looked up at Veskara, and something shifted in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, something Older than both. I'll relay the message, she said simply. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She walked toward the door with the same unhurried, deliberate steps she'd entered with. At the threshold she paused. Chancellor. She didn't turn around. In your review of human history, did your analysts cover the siege of Leningrad? Viscara tilted their head. We are familiar with your historical conflicts. Yes, Mamara nodded slowly as if confirming something to herself. 48 hours is fine. She walked out her aide, a young man named Dio, who had been waiting outside with white knuckles and a cold sweat, fell into step beside her. The moment she cleared the doors. Delegate, he whispered, should I contact the evacuation coordinators? Myra's jaw tightened. She thought of that cracked screen, that school, that girl who'd looked up at the sky and felt, for the first time, that the universe was vast and full of possibility. No, she said quietly, contact Director Chen. Tell him the timeline is confirmed. Dio stared at her. And what do I tell him the timeline is for? Myra glanced back once, just once, at the ancient doors of the grand hall closing behind her. Tell him, she said to begin. The other thing. Dio opened his mouth, closed it, typed the message. 11,000 years of permanence had just been given. 48 hours. It didn't know that yet. Thing about humanity that the Galactic Council had never truly understood was this: most species, when cornered, panic. Outward, they broadcast distress. Signals, they call allies, they move troops to borders, send fleets to front lines, make noise in all directions like a wounded animal trying to appear larger than it is. Humans, when cornered, go quiet. They go quiet and they go inward. And they start doing things that don't look like preparation until it's far too late to stop them. In the 48 hours following the ultimatum, Earth made no military broadcasts, no emergency fleet mobilizations were detected, no distress signals were sent to the handful of smaller species that had cultivated cautious friendships with humanity. From the outside, from the sensor arrays of the 3 Council observation ships parked at the edge of the Sol system, the planet looked almost peaceful. C3 noticed first. She was 29 years old by Alvani reckoning, which made her young enough to still trust her instincts and old enough to know when something was deeply wrong. As a junior intelligence analyst assigned to the Earth desk, she had spent 4 years learning to read human behavior patterns, their communication spikes, their logistical signatures, the thermal bloom of a mobilizing military. She was looking for those patterns now. She wasn't finding them. Run it again, she told her console. Her console ran it again. Same result. Earth's communication volume had dropped by 62% in the 6 hours since the ultimatum. Military frequencies, the ones they knew about, were almost silent. Orbital traffic had slowed to a trickle. C3 pulled up historical records. She cross-referenced, she compared signatures. Then she sat very still for a long moment and felt the small hairs along her secondary arms rise slowly. She'd seen this pattern before, not in alien records, in human ones, specifically in a historical archive she'd accessed during her training, a deep dive into human military psychology that her supervisor had called excessive and unnecessary. She'd done it anyway because she was thorough and because humans were genuinely the strangest assignment she'd ever drawn. The pattern matched a behavior documented in dozens of human conflicts throughout their history. Thermopylae, Dunkirk, the Winter War. Dien Bien Phu, the Siege of Sarajevo. It wasn't the pattern of a species preparing to flee or surrender. It was the pattern of a species preparing to absorb. They were pulling everything inward, concentrating, compressing like a material under pressure that was deciding very quietly whether to shatter or to become a diamond. She filed her report immediately, flagged priority, amber, and sent it up the chain. Meanwhile on Earth, the 48 hours looked like this. In Geneva, 17 heads of government gathered in a basement conference room. No speeches, no rhetoric. They spoke for 6 hours and produced a document 43 pages long. It was not a plan for surrender. It was a plan they had been building in pieces for 22 years, updated quarterly, revised after every council overreach, every territorial slight, every diplomatic humiliation quietly swallowed and catalogued. They called it with very human humor Project Boomerang. In the Atacama Desert, 12 crates of equipment that had been listed as decommissioned scientific instruments in council trade inventories were unpacked by people who did not appear in any personnel database. Equipment was not scientific. In the Pacific, 3 submarines running completely dark descended to depths that put them beneath any sensor sweep the Council's observation ships were capable of. They carried things important. Things that had been built in pieces across 4 continents over the span of a decade and never fully assembled in one location until now. In a school in Lagos, the very city where I young Mariano had once watched first contact on a cracked screen, a teacher calmly told her students that tomorrow's classes were canceled and that everyone should go home and stay with their families. She smiled when she said it. The children, sensing something in that smile, went home quickly and held their parents' hands a little tighter than usual. C3's report was received by her direct supervisor at the 11-hour mark. He read it, he frowned, he appended a note that read, "Analyst demonstrates pattern matching enthusiasm that exceeds available evidence, recommend recalibration." He filed it as priority green and moved on. C3 read the recategorization and felt something cold move through her chest. She pulled up her screen again. Earth's communication signals had now dropped by 79%. She thought about what happens to materials under pressure. She thought about diamonds. She opened a new report and began typing faster, this time with the particular urgency of someone who knows they are probably not going to be listened to but cannot in good conscience stop trying. Outside her viewport, 3 council warships held their positions at the edge of the Sol system, their sensors sweeping a planet that appeared to be sleeping. It was not sleeping. 41 hours remained on the clock. Hour 47. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council filled for what would be its final formal session with a particular atmosphere that can only be described as satisfied, not triumphant. The council was too old and too practiced at power to bother with triumph. Satisfaction was quieter than that, more comfortable. It was the feeling of an institution confirming what it had always known about itself, that it was necessary, permanent, and correct. 47 species representatives were present in body or holographic projection. The agenda was clean: the vote to formalize Earth's Threat class designation would take approximately 12 minutes. There would be some procedural commentary, some recorded objections from the 2 or 3 species who still maintained trade relations with humanity and had financial objections rather than moral ones, and then the motion would pass. After that, there would be a brief recess during which several delegations had arranged what amounted to a quiet celebration in the hall's reception wing. 3 species had already begun preliminary negotiations about which asteroid belts in the Sol system they preferred. Viscara called the session to order at precisely hour 47, and the hall responded with the practiced efficiency of 11,000 years of institutional muscle memory. Procedural motions were filed. Objections were noted and overruled. The designation document was uploaded to the formal record. The vote counter appeared on the main display. It reached 39 in favor before the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge. A complete total. An absolute extinction of every light source in the Grand Hall simultaneously, followed 3 seconds later by the failure of every backup system, every emergency generator, every bioluminescent emergency strip embedded in the walls, and every personal device in the room. 47 species sat in perfect darkness. Silence lasted 4 seconds. Later, those who survived would all remember those 4 seconds differently. The Kalthani ambassador remembered them as the longest of his life. The representative from the Dravosi collective remembered thinking it was a power surge, embarrassing but manageable. A young aide from a small species called the Murathi, a people the council had protected into near total dependency over 2 centuries, would later say she felt in those 4 seconds something she had never felt in the Grand Hall before. She felt hope. Then every screen in the hall came to life at once, not with the council's insignia, not with an emergency system readout with a face. Mara Akono looked out from 47 screens simultaneously, her expression carrying the particular calm of someone who has already made peace with a decision they cannot take back. To the Galactic Council, she said, her voice was even, unhurried, the voice of someone reading a statement they wrote with great care. You have made a decision about humanity without understanding what humanity is. You reviewed our military capacity, our expansion, our technology, and you concluded you understood us. A pause. You don't. No one in the hall spoke. For 30 years, you have watched us grow. You interpreted our growth as aggression, because that is the only framework you have, the framework of species who expand because they want to dominate. We want to understand why you assumed we were like you. Viscara, standing in the darkness, was very still. We have decided to provide a demonstration, Mara continued, not of our military capacity. You already know about that, or you think you do. A demonstration of something else, something that's harder to scan for. Her eyes on every screen looked directly outward with an expression that was almost sorrowful. Whatever comes next, you chose this. We want you to remember that the feed cut. For exactly 1 second the hall was silent again. Then the first explosion shook the station's outer ring. It was not a large explosion. It was precise, surgical. It took out the communications array on the station's southern face with the efficiency of something that knew exactly where to hit and exactly how hard. An explosion designed not to destroy but to disconnect. The council Station's external communications died. Then the docking bay door sealed, not via the Council's own lockdown protocol. Those were still offline. They sealed via command string that originated from within the station's own operating system, buried in a subroutine that had been installed during a routine maintenance visit 18 months ago by a human technical contractor whose credentials had been impeccably forged. Viscara turned to their head of security, a Kelani colonel who had not yet closed his mouth since the screens came on. Override the docking seals, the Chancellor said. The voice was still controlled, still the voice of an institution that had never needed to panic. The colonel tried. The system accepted his credentials. It confirmed his command. It displayed a completion bar that reached 100%. The door stayed sealed. In the darkness, with 47 species representatives beginning to understand in slow, terrible increments what was happening, Viscara stood at the center of 11,000 years of unchallenged power and felt for the first time something the Chancellor had no word for in a human archive. There was a word for it. It was called reckoning. Admiral Kethvar of the Kalthani Third Fleet had been commanding warships for 40 years. He had fought border skirmishes with the Murray resistance before they were pacified. He had overseen the corrective engagement against the Dravosi splinter colonies. The outer arm, he had in short seen every kind of space combat the Galactic Council had needed to conduct in 4 decades, and he had won all of it. Because the Council's fleets were the finest in the galaxy, he looked at his sensor readout and understood in the marrow of his bones that he was in serious trouble. There were 42 human ships in his engagement zone. He knew this because his sensors were functioning correctly. What his sensors were telling him, what made his hands grip the command rail hard enough to ache, was that those 42 ships were nothing like what was in humanity's registered fleet manifest. The ships the Council had on record were adequate mid-tier military hardware, nothing remarkable, the kind of fleet you'd expect from a species that had only had FTL for 60 years. These ships were not that. They were dark, genuinely dark, not just running low emissions, but actively absorbing his sensor pings, returning nothing. He was locating them only by the gaps they left in the stellar background, like holes cut in space. Their drive signatures were nothing he recognized, and they were moving with a tactical coordination that his own fleet's AI was struggling to predict, shifting formations in ways that seemed to anticipate his responses before he gave them. Get me a weapons lock on the lead vessel, he said. His targeting officer tried. The lock established. Then the ship moved just slightly, a micro adjustment so small it shouldn't have mattered, and the lock slid off like water. Tried again. Same result. They're reading our targeting systems, his officer said, voice carefully controlled, actively countering. Kethvar watched the display. The human ships were not attacking his fleet. They were containing it, positioning themselves with geometric precision that blocked every exit vector without firing a single shot. They were herding his warships like animals, and they were doing it patiently, as if they had all the time in the world, as if this was the most routine thing imaginable. His communications officer turned from her console. Admiral, I'm receiving a direct channel from the human flagship. Kethvar straightened, put it through the Voice that came through the bridge. Speakers was female, unhurried, and carried the particular accent of someone from humanity's East Asian coastal regions. Admiral Kethvar, my name is Captain Una Park. I want you to know that we have no intention of destroying your ships. Keith's jaw tightened. Then, what are your intentions, Captain? To make sure you watch, she said simply. Inside the council station, the scene was fracturing along predictable lines. The most powerful species representatives were demanding, issuing orders, threatening. Their aides were trying desperately to reach their home fleets through personal devices that had been somehow inexplicably individually disabled in ways that targeted each device's specific hardware frequency, meaning whoever had done this had known the exact communications hardware of every delegation's equipment in advance. The smaller species representatives were quieter. The Murray aide, her name was Vel, 24 years old, from a colony that hadn't had a self-determined government in 200 years, sat in the darkness and felt that feeling again, that strange, electric, dangerous feeling. She found herself thinking of something her grandmother had told her when she was young, about the years before the council's protection. Her grandmother had used that word with a particular tone, not gratitude, something more complex. Now Vil sat in the dark and listened to the sounds of an institution discovering its own limits, and she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about what freedom felt like when it was theoretical versus what it might feel like when it was real. C3. Watching from the intelligence deck of an Alvani observation post 17 light minutes away, was pulling data as fast as her console could process it. She could see the fleet engagements. She could see the station's lockdown. She was correlating timestamps, cross-referencing, and what she was finding was making her feel something she would later describe in her memoirs as the sensation of a floor dropping away. The human technical contractor who had installed the command subbing in the station's docking system, she'd found his file, his credentials were forged. Yes, but the skill of the forgery suggested resources and planning on a scale that implied this wasn't reactive. She pulled the contractor's visit records 18 months ago. She pulled other maintenance records 31 months ago. Different contractor, different credentials, also human, also impeccably documented. She started correlating human civilian visits to the station. Going back 7 years, she found 17 separate incidents, 17 human personnel who had at various times for various officially logged reasons accessed various parts of the station's infrastructure. She mapped what each of them had touched. Together they had mapped, accessed, or installed something in every critical system the station possessed. C3 sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling and breath. Carefully, they hadn't prepared for this moment. They hadn't prepared after the ultimatum. They hadn't even prepared in the past year. They had been preparing for 7 years. The ultimatum hadn't triggered Project Boomerang. The ultimatum had simply told humanity when to use it. Captain Park's voice came through Cathar's bridge again. Admiral, I'd recommend watching the station's main feed in about 30 seconds. Cathar looked. He watched the Grand Hall's external cameras still functioning, still broadcasting, just not to anyone the council intended. Showed the moment 47 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy understood that the walls they'd trusted for 11,000 Years had never actually belonged to them. Park gave KTHVAR the 30 seconds. She'd promised, then she said the demonstration is almost complete. When the council station reappeared, it was 4.3 light years from its original position, not destroyed, not damaged. Every corridor intact, every life support system functioning, every representative unharmed. The station simply was no longer where it had been. Relocated to the edge of the galaxy's habitable band with a precision that required either a staggering coincidence of physics or a faster-than-light jump drive of a caliber that the Council had classified as theoretically impossible. Attached to the station's primary docking bay, accessible on every interior screen, was a message: 7 words, when you're ready to talk, signal us. That was all. No demands, no terms, no threats. 7 words in a communications frequency, and then silence. The Galactic Council had 47 species worth of representatives, a fully functional life support system, 2 months of emergency rations, and no way to contact anyone, because the relocation had put them outside standard communications range by exactly the margin required to make all their arrays useless. They had not been left to die. They had been left to think. The galaxy, meanwhile, woke up to the news the way sleeping person wakes to a thunderclap. Not gradually, but all at once, with that electric disorientation of a world fundamentally rearranged. The Council was gone, not dead, gone. Removed by humanity. The reactions came in waves, and they were not what anyone might have predicted if they had predicted that humanity would one day bring the 11,000-year-old governing body of the known galaxy to its knees, which almost no one had. The Kelani military went to immediate high alert and began moving fleets, but toward what? Humanity's fleet had withdrawn completely. Earth was quiet. There was no invasion to repel, no territory being seized, no ultimatum being issued. The Kelani war machine, finally tuned for countering aggression, found itself pointed at nothing and stood down in confused increments over the course of 72 hours. The Dravosi Collective Senate was in emergency session for 9 hours before someone pointed out that 3 of the policies they'd been trying to get the Council to reform for decades were now technically unenforceable. This observation was followed by a very long silence, and then the kind of conversation that hadn't been possible for 2 centuries. 6 species that the Council had kept in managed dependency, resource controlled, militarily restricted, quietly drained, did nothing publicly for the first 48 hours. Their government communications showed extreme internal activity. What they were actually doing was having the same conversation in 6 different languages. Is this real? Is this actually happening? What do we do if it's real? The Marathi people's response was simpler than all of that. Vel had made it back to her quarters on the station before the relocation. She'd been there for 6 hours when she accessed the station's internal network and found something she hadn't expected. Humans had left the library intact. Every archive, every database, every historical record, all accessible, all unlocked, including the sections the Council had restricted. She opened the Murithi historical files, the real ones, the pre-proction ones, the ones she'd been told didn't exist because there was nothing substantial before the Council's intervention. And she started reading. And she didn't stop for 11 hours when She finally looked up, her face was wet. And she didn't fully remember crying. C3 was filing what would become the most read intelligence report in Albany history. She sat at her console for 4 hours and wrote with the careful precision of someone who knows they are documenting something that will be studied for a very long time. She wrote about the 7 years of preparation. She wrote about the 17 maintenance visits. She wrote about the pattern she'd identified before the event and the pattern she was seeing now, because there was a pattern to what came after, and it was as deliberate as everything that had preceded it. Humanity had not moved to fill the power vacuum in the hours after the most significant power shift in galactic history. The species responsible had returned its fleet to home space, resumed civilian communications, and according to signals, Intercept appeared to be having a significant number of conversations on the topic of lunch. They were not expanding, they were not seizing, they were not doing anything that looked like what a species does when it has just won. They were waiting. C3 stared at this data for a long time. Then she opened a separate document, personal, not official, and wrote 3 words. They meant it. She was referring to Mara Akono's recorded message, the part that every analyst had catalogued as rhetorical, the part where Mara had said, "We are not here to dominate, we are here to demonstrate." Every other species in humanity's position would be claiming territory by now. Humanity was listening to music on open frequencies and apparently deciding collectively what to have for lunch. C3 had spent 4 years studying humans. She had read their history, their literature, their philosophy, their war records, and their peace treaties, and their spectacular, painful, ongoing project of trying to be better than they'd been the day before. She understood now, in the particular way that understanding arrives not as a thought but as a physical sensation, what they were doing. They were giving everyone else a moment, just a moment to breathe, to process, to decide what they wanted the next 11,000 years to look like without a gun to their head or a hand on their shoulder. It was either the most sophisticated power play in galactic history, C3 thought, or it was exactly what it appeared to be. She found herself hopping with a ferocity that surprised her that it was the latter. Admiral Chen Bayan was 61 years old, and he had not slept in 36 hours. And he was standing at the viewport of Way Station Kepler, looking at the stars and feeling something that wasn't quite victory. He had commanded Project Boomerang from its inception 22 years ago. A younger version of himself had sat across from a government committee in a basement in Geneva and made a case that had seemed even to him borderline paranoid, that the Galactic Council would eventually decide humanity was a problem to be managed, and that when that day came, humanity needed to be ready with something other than a conventional military response, because a conventional military response against 47 species with 11,000 years of combined military development was not a response. It was a gesture. What he had proposed instead was architecture, not weapons architecture, a 20-year project of mapping, embedding, preparing, and positioning, not to destroy the council but to displace it, to remove it from its own systems so cleanly and completely that the act itself would communicate something that no weapon could, that humanity had been everywhere inside everything for years and had chosen not to use that access destructively. The message wasn't "we are dangerous." Message was "we are disciplined," and those are very different things. It had worked with a precision that frankly still made Chen's hands shake slightly when he thought about all the variables that could have broken wrong. His second-in-command, Director Fatima al-Rashid, came to stand beside him at the viewport. She handed him coffee, real coffee from Earth, the good kind, and stood quietly for a moment. "Reports from the outer engagement zones confirm full withdrawal," she said. "Fleet is home. Civilians are safe. Council Station is broadcasting its first request for communication." Already Chen raised an eyebrow. Apparently, 2 days of emergency rations and no outside communication is very clarifying. Chen almost smiled, almost. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What's the damage?" he asked. "The other kind of damage, the kind that didn't show up in military reports." Fatima was quiet for a moment. She understood what he was asking. 3 species have declared emergency isolation. They're not hostile, they're scared. The Velshari have pulled their trade routes. The Seth collective is making noise about retaliation, but their military capacity is, she paused, theatrical. And the ones under council protection, 6 of them are in active internal communication. The Muriarshi stopped. Chen looked at her. "The Murithi are in the streets," Fatima said quietly, "not rioting, just standing in their major cities together." She pulled up a surveillance image on her tablet and showed him. Chen looked at it for a long time. Millions of people standing in open spaces looking up. He handed the tablet back. He felt something complex move through his chest, the specific ache of someone who has done something they believe was right and is still not certain they had the right to do it. "Mara's on her way back?" he asked. "Arrives in 4 hours. He nodded. He looked back at the stars. "I keep thinking about the moment of the vote," he said quietly. "They were at 39 votes when we cut the power. 39 species ready to sign Earth's managed decline into formal law." He paused, and I wonder sometimes if we'd waited, if we'd tried diplomacy one more time, if Chen. Fatima's voice was gentle but direct. They had already decided. The diplomacy had already happened. Mara spent 4 years in that hall watching them decide. She paused. This wasn't us refusing to negotiate. This was us understanding that the negotiation was over. He was quiet. "The question isn't whether we were right to act," she continued. "The question is what we do now, because we have about a 6-week window where the galaxy is still processing this before some of them start deciding we're the new threat." She turned to look at him. "And we need to be very clear, very fast, about what we actually want." "And what do we actually want?" he asked. It wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to say it out loud to hear it confirmed. "The same thing we've wanted since first contact," Fatima said. "To exist, to learn, to be part of a galaxy that isn't owned by anyone." She paused. "Which means we need to make sure that everyone who just watched us remove the council doesn't spend the next century afraid of us." Chen finished his coffee. He thought about 22 years of preparation, of infrastructure quietly seated across the galaxy, of 17 contractors and 7 years of patient work, of 42 ships moving in perfect formation and never once firing a weapon. He thought about all the things they could have done in this moment and had deliberately chosen not to. "Get me a channel to Mara's ship," he said finally. Already open. Fatima said. He picked up the calm Myra. Her voice came back slightly lagged by distance. Chen, the council is asking to communicate. I heard. What do you want to say to them? The line was quiet for a moment. He could hear the hum of her ship's engines in the background. I want to say, Mara said slowly, that we didn't take their house. We just changed the locks and were willing to hand back the keys. A pause. On very different terms. Chen breathed out. There's one more thing, Mara said. Her voice had shifted. Quieter, more personal. The Murray, I saw the images. Yeah, we need to be careful, Chen. They're looking at us like we're something we're not. He frowned. What do you mean? They're looking at us like we're saviors. Her voice was steady but weighted. And we can't be that. We can't be the new council or the new salvation. We have to be the people who hand everyone the tools and then get out of the way. Chen looked at the Murray image on Fatima's tablet across the room. All those faces turned upward. That's harder than removing the council, he said. Yes. Mara agreed simply. It is. The ship hummed between them. 4 hours, he asked. 4 hours, she confirmed. Make sure there's good coffee. The ship's humanity sent to the 47 species were not impressive. That was intentional. They were Type 4 transit vessels, the galactic equivalent of a commercial shuttle. No weapons arrays, no military shielding, no visible armament of any kind. Each one carried 2 people, in most cases a linguist or cultural specialist, and either a scientist, a doctor, or a historian. Not a single general, not a single weapon. The message, the vessel configuration sent was deliberate and precise. We are not coming to negotiate from strength. We already demonstrated our strength. We are now choosing not to use it. Please notice the difference. Some species received them with hostility. The Kelani intercepted the first shuttle at the border and held it for 6 hours, running every scan in their arsenal. They found no weapons, no concealed systems, nothing that shouldn't be there. They found 2 humans who waited out the scans with the patience of people who had expected exactly this, brought excellent reading material, and declined to escalate when the Kelthani commander got loud. When they were finally allowed to proceed, the linguist, a 44-year-old woman named Dr. Priya, told the commander pleasantly, "Thank you for your thoroughness. We would have done the same." The commander had no response to that. He filed a report that described her as unnervingly reasonable and let them go. 3 species refused the shuttles entirely. Their borders went dark. Humanity noted the refusals, filed them, and sent a second message. We understand. We'll be here when you're ready. No third message, no pressure. Just the statement left open like a door. The Marathi response was the hardest. Vel had made it back from the council station through a complicated series of transfers on civilian vessels. She arrived home to a world in an extraordinary state. Not celebration exactly, but something more fragile and more significant, a kind of collective exhale that had been held for 2 centuries. When the human shuttle arrived in Marathi orbital space, every government official, military officer, and senior administrator on the planet tried to be the one to receive them. Resulting scheduling conflict was so severe that it accidentally became a news story, which became its own kind of cultural moment because the Murray hadn't had a news cycle this competitive about good things in living memory. Two humans who stepped off the shuttle were a historian named James O. and a water systems engineer named Dr. Yara. Linkfist, they were by any military measure completely unimpressive. James was slightly rumpled. Yara had clearly been asleep on the transit and still had a crease on her cheek. The reception committee that met them was the largest gathering of Murray officials in 40 years. James looked at them all and said, very gently, we're not here to help you rebuild, we're here to ask what you want to rebuild and whether there's anything we can offer that might be useful. He paused. We also want to make it very clear that we don't expect anything in return, and you don't owe us anything for what happened. That wasn't done for you. It was done because it was right. There's a difference. The senior minister in the reception line, a woman who had spent 30 years navigating council oversight and had the careful, contained expression of someone who had learned not to show too much, blinked once. You don't want anything, she asked. We genuinely love to learn about your Procont agricultural systems, Yara said. James has been reading about them for years. He gets quite passionate. She glanced at James. Embarrassingly passionate, honestly. James opened his mouth to object, and the minister, for the first time in what appeared to be a very long time, laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was barely a sound at all, but it was real. And the aide standing behind her, a young woman named Vel, who had requested this assignment specifically, felt it in her chest like something small and important. Unlocking C3's assignment was different. She wasn't sent as a recipient of a human shuttle. She was sent as her people's representative to the first informal gathering that humanity had quietly proposed, not an assembly, not a council, not anything with legal weight. Yet, just a gathering, 20 species if they chose to come, a repurposed human cargo freighter. 2 weeks her council had debated for 3 days. She had argued for attending until her voice was raw. They dismantled the most powerful governance structure in galactic history. The elder VTH had said he was 800 years old and had the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived by trusting nothing. You're suggesting we walk willingly onto their ship? I'm suggesting, C3 said carefully, that a species that spent 22 years preparing to displace the council without killing a single person and then spent the following 2 weeks sending unarmed shuttles with doctors and historians. That species is probably not laying a trap. She paused. And I'm suggesting that if we don't go, we'll be making a decision about the next 10,000 years of our future based on fear rather than evidence. The elder looked at her for a long time. You like them, he said, not an accusation, an observation. C3 thought about that honestly. I think I understand them, she said, which is different. A pause. I spent 4 years studying them, and what I've concluded is that they are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered, and that the most dangerous thing about them is not their weapons or their technology or their planning. She met his eyes. It's that they are genuinely, frustratingly, incomprehensibly committed to trying to do the right thing, even when it's harder, even when no one's watching, even when they'd be perfectly justified in doing something else. The elder was quiet. That, C3 said, is what I think we should go see for ourselves. The Alvani delegation voted to attend. 17 other species voted to attend. 2 more were still deciding when the freighter's departure date arrived. They Both sent messages saying they would. Joined by remote link. 20 species in various states of hope and suspicion, and carefully maintained neutrality turned toward a repurposed cargo ship and the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. The cargo freighter Meridian was not beautiful. It had been a bulk hauler for 11 years before being acquired and refitted, and no amount of interior renovation had fully erased the particular aesthetic of a ship designed to carry ore and grain across long distances, a functional utilitarian bluntness that showed up in every corridor and ceiling height and seating arrangement. Mara Ayanquo had chosen it personally, and she had chosen it precisely because it was not beautiful. Because the last thing this gathering needed was a room designed to impress. She stood at the entrance to the main conference space, a repurposed cargo bay ceiling 20 m high, the walls left in their original scored metal, and watched 20 species representatives file in, and she felt the weight of the moment the way you feel, whether not just in your mind but across your entire body. She recognized Vel, the Marthy aide had been pointed out to her in the briefings, the one who'd been on the council station, the one who'd read the archives, the one who'd requested the assignment to receive James and Yara, and had stood in the back of the room during that first meeting with the particular stillness of someone trying to absorb too much at once. She recognized C3, whose intelligence reports she had read extensively during the preparation years, the Alvani analyst who had almost sounded the alarm in time, who had been right and not been heard and had kept filing reports. Anyway, she recognized faces she had only seen in briefings and DASAs and cultural studies, and she felt the particular vulnerability of a moment when the theoretical becomes actual, when the plan becomes the room you're standing in and all the things you can no longer take back. She was not afraid. She was something more complex than afraid. She called the gathering to order at 900 ship time, and the way she did it was this. She said, "Let's start," and sat down. No ceremony, no gavel, no recorded protocol. Just a woman sitting in a converted cargo bay, saying, "Let's start," and somehow, maybe because of the simplicity of it, maybe because every species in that room was exhausted and overwhelmed and secretly relieved not to be performing, the room settled and the work began. They talked for 11 days, not continuously. There were rest cycles, meals, the careful navigation of 14 different biological needs and 6 incompatible atmospheric preferences, and the extraordinary logistical work of translation across 20 languages in real time. There were arguments. One session had to be suspended for 6 hours when the Kalthani representative and the Dravosi delegate began a confrontation that predated humanity's involvement in interstellar politics by 300 years. Myra let them argue for 4 hours before she interrupted, not to adjudicate but to say, "We should probably note this conflict formally so we can actually address it rather than work around it for the next 1,000 years the way the council did." Both delegates stared at her. "Just a thought," she added. "The conflict was noted formally. It didn't resolve on the Meridian. It was far too old and far too deep for 11 days, but it was noted, acknowledged, documented, and given a working group which was more progress than 300 years had achieved. That became the rhythm of those 11 days. Not solution that was too ambitious, too fast, too much the language of an institution trying to manage things, but acknowledgement, documentation, the patient work of getting things onto a table where they could actually be seen. On the fourth day, Vel asked to speak. She was not a senior representative. She had no formal authority. She was an aide, 24 years old, from a world that had been managed into dependency for 2 centuries. She asked to speak, and Mara said yes without hesitation, because that was another thing she decided about this gathering: no hierarchy of voices. If you were in the room, you had the floor. Vel stood up and the room went quiet, and she stood there for a moment, visibly composing herself, and then she said, "I've been trying to figure out what to say for 4 days. I know I'm not senior enough to be here, and I want to acknowledge that." She paused. "But I was on the council station when it happened, and I read the archives, the real ones." She stopped again. "I just want to say, and I'm saying this to the human delegation specifically, I understand what you said about not being saviors. I understand it intellectually. But I grew up in a world where the history of my people before the council was described as primitive and incomplete, and it wasn't. It was full. It was complete." Her voice tightened briefly, and someone chose to hide that from us. She looked at Mara. "So whatever you think you're not, whatever you're trying not to be, what you actually were to us was the moment we got our history back. I need you to know that. I need that to be in the record." The cargo bay was very quiet. Myra looked at Vel for a moment. "It's in the record," she said. "Thank you." On the 9th day they began drafting the first language of what would eventually become the Meridian Accord, a document so different from the Council's foundational treaties that comparing them was almost meaningless. Where the Council's founding documents had codified management, hierarchy, and protected status, the Meridian draft codified something simpler and more difficult: the right of self-determination for every signatory species, with mutual aid offered freely and accepted freely, and no obligation attached to either. It was 6 pages long. The Council's founding treaty had been 900. C3 spent most of the 9th day reading and rereading those 6 pages, looking for the catch, looking for the clause buried in the language that revealed the actual cost, the actual leverage being built. She didn't find one. She went to Mara that evening in the small common area where the human delegation took their meals, and she sat across from her. And she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Please," Mara said. "What do you get from this?" Mara poured herself water, considered the question honestly. "Probably nothing for 50 years, she said. "Maybe a century. The Accord won't benefit Earth materially for generations." She paused. "But my granddaughter will live in a galaxy that isn't owned by anyone, and her children will live in one where that's just how things are, where no species assumes that power means ownership." She looked at C3. "That's what I get." C3 sat with that. "How do you know it'll work?" she asked. "I don't," Mara said simply. "We've tried things that didn't work approximately 10,000 times throughout our history. We're very experienced at it." A faint, exhausted smile. "But we're also still here, still trying. Apparently, that's the part we can't turn off." C3 thought of the emergency broadcast, the music and the frequency, the horns and percussion she'd heard in her rescue pod, floating in the dark, waiting for her people to find her. She had looked it up later. It was something called jazz, a human music form built on structure and improvisation, simultaneously rigid enough to hold, together free enough to go anywhere. She thought that was probably not a coincidence. On the 11th day, 20 species signed the first draft of the Meridian Accord. 6 refused or abstained. 4 more were still deciding. Nobody was forced. The vote was recorded. The document was sealed. The Meridian began the journey back to civilized space, carrying 20 species worth of representatives who had arrived as strangers and were leaving us something not yet named, not allies, not friends. Exactly, but something more honest and more durable than either. People who had sat in the same ugly room, argued in the same translated chaos, and chosen with full awareness of how hard it would be to try. In the bay's rear observation deck, Mara stood alone at the viewport. The stars outside were the same stars that had watched 11,000 years of the Council's permanence. They did not care about the Accord. They did not care about humanity or the Alvani or the Murray or the 47 species still deciding what to do with themselves. They were older than all of it and would outlast all of it, but the people trying that mattered. That was the only thing that ever had. She heard footsteps behind her, Vel of all people, tentative in the doorway. Sorry, I didn't realize anyone was in here. It's all right, Mara gestured to the viewport. Come see. Vel came and stood beside her. They were quiet for a while, both looking at the same stars. What happens now? Vel asked. Mara thought about it honestly, about the 6 species who hadn't signed, about the Kelani generals who were still running threat assessments, about the 300 years of Murithi history that needed to be told, about the council station still sitting at the galaxy's edge, still waiting, its occupants now finally asking to talk about all the long, unglamorous, necessary work that was still ahead. Now she said, we do the hard part. Vel nodded slowly, seemed to settle something in herself. I think, she said quietly, my people are going to be good at the hard part. Myra looked at her, at this young woman who had read 2 centuries of hidden history in 11 hours and come out the other side not broken, but illuminated. I think you are, she said. I think that's what 200 years of persistence under impossible circumstances actually produces. She paused. We've seen it before in our own history, when people who have been told for a very long time that they are not enough turn out to be exactly enough. Vel was quiet in the viewport. The stars moved slowly with the ships turning. Somewhere on the Meridian, someone from the Alvani delegation had started playing music. C3. Probably from her personal files. The sound filtered through the corridors. Something structured and free at the same time, something that knew where it was going but wasn't entirely sure of the route, and was absolutely committed to the journey. In the back of the observation deck, on a personal tablet, with the stars sliding past and the music in the air, C3 of the Alvani opened a new document. She had been an intelligence analyst for 4 years. She was going to be something else now. She wasn't sure exactly what. Historian maybe, or something that didn't have a name yet. In any language she knew, she wrote the first line. It began with a threat they should never have made. She paused, read it, then beneath it wrote the second. It ended, or rather, it began with 20 species in an ugly room choosing to try. She saved it. Outside, the stars held their ancient positions, unchanged and indifferent and utterly unable to stop what was happening beneath them, the slow, difficult, extraordinary work of a galaxy deciding to grow up. It had started with a threat. It would continue for a very long time after.